Fading in.
Dun, 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 dun.
All right.
Hi, everybody. It's spooky season, so thanks for joining us for our seminar. This is Injecting Horror into Your Adventures. I'm Laura Picola-Williams. Thanks to Stephen Newton for asking me to moderate, and for Susan Murph, who will be moderating the Zoom questions and the Twitch chat. I also wanted to give out a shout out to Carmen Vance, who couldn't join us tonight, but is an amazing artist, so definitely check out her work if you get a chance. We are taking questions live from our audience, so if you're on Zoom, look at the bottom of your screen and please use the Q&A tab to submit your questions. Twitch chat is being monitored by Susan as well, so you can ask questions in the Twitch chat as well. The seminar is going to last about 80 minutes, and we're going to get to hear from some of our favorite people in the DCC horror scene. For our panelists tonight, we have Bob Brinkman, Brad McDevitt, Stephen Newton.
Hello.
And Thorin Thompson.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Let's get started. The first question that I have for all of you is, who or what inspired you to get into horror or contemporarily inspires you today? So let's start with Bob. Bob Brinkman is a game designer for hire and the voice of the Goodman Games Gen Con raffle. He is the author of Blasphemy and Larceny in Lankmar and the forthcoming Dark Trails adventure, The Malevolent Seven, as well as being the creator of the Skull and Crossbones classics. Go ahead, Bob. What inspired you to get into horror?
I would say a cruel prank by my sister when I was young. When I was a kid, you always have, you go into the basement, you have sort of that feeling of basement creeps, right? And we had a section of our basement that was closed off with a door. And I came home from school, I was down in the basement, and all of a sudden that door opened because my sister had come home early. She's 7 years older than I am, and had been waiting for me. And I was terrified, but once that rush, once the terror receded and I stopped trying to claw my way through the ceiling, I realized what a rush it was. And so I started pursuing horror movies and reading a lot of horror, Stephen King. And then I discovered Lovecraft, all atmosphere, no action, and absolutely just fell in love with Lovecraft's use of words. And then Sandy Peterson sold me my copy of Call of Cthulhu, and I've never looked back.
The Sandy Peterson?
Yep, at my second Gen Con, the first one in Milwaukee at the Mecca Convention Center.
Wow, I hope you got it signed.
Oh, yes.
That's awesome. Well, that's amazing, Bob. I'm going to ask Brad next. Brad, what inspired you to get into horror?
That would be Star Trek, actually. One of my very, very first memories around 1968 or so was walking into our living room and seeing the Man Trap episode of Star Trek, just as the salt vampire revealed itself. Mind you, I was 3 years old at the time. My other earliest memory is watching the first Godzilla movie when I was maybe 4. Between that and 3 older brothers who were all comic books fans and introduced me to the Bernie Wrightson run on Swamp Thing, that was pretty much the end of my chance of ever having a normal childhood. Somewhere along the line later on, I discovered Stephen King, and then I discovered Lovecraft, and just like with Bob, that was pretty much the end of it. Though, interestingly enough, yeah, it was several years after I started reading Lovecraft that I even heard of gaming at all, let alone, and then a few years later, it's like, they made a role-playing game based on this stuff? Are they nuts? But yeah, that was that's what kind of got me into horror.
I like how Bob touched on how you can take lived experiences and then transfer those experiences for others, and then also how your lived experiences and how horror makes you feel. Like that feeling never goes away once you figure out you can do that for other people. Like that's got to be intoxicating. So that's great, Brad. Thank you. Next is Stephen. Stephen, oh, Brad, I didn't read your introduction. Oh my goodness. I was so excited to hear your intro. Before I get to Stephen, I'm actually going to give you your accolades. So in case anybody didn't know, because he's a household name, Brad McDevitt is a commercial artist with almost 700 publishing credits, with over 150 of those for Goodman Games, stretching back to 2002's Complete Guide to the Drow and the original module Idols of the Rat King for Dungeon Crawl Classics #1, long before there was a DCC RPG. He has also done work as diverse as Traveler, Dungeons and Dragons, Deadlands, Battletech, and was an original contributor to the Legend of the Five Rings CCG. In his spare time, he likes to watch movies with Jess, his wife of nearly 2 decades, read, and try out new genres of music. So thanks, Brad. And I know we have a special treat where we're going to get to see some of your art later. So I'm looking forward to that. Okay, Stephen, I will not forget to introduce you. Next
All
is
right.
Stephen Newton is the guy behind Thick Skull Adventures, one of the original third-party publishers for Goodman Games. Stephen's adventures for Thick Skull Adventures include Attack of the Frogs, The Haunting of Larvik Island, the latest horror western, The Last Will and Testament of Obadiah Faulkner. He's also the writer of a few DCC Halloween horror adventures. They Served Brandolin Red, which I don't know if that's what you're drinking tonight, The Corpse That Love Built, and Creep Scrag Creep. In his spare time, he enjoys reading, co-hosting his horror podcast Black Ink Red Film, and making luck checks. So go ahead, Stephen. What got you into horror?
Yeah, I like to make those luck checks. So first of all, Laura, thank you so much for moderating us tonight. Susan, thank you so much for handling things behind the scenes. And thanks to Goodman Games for allowing us to get some airtime on their Twitch channel. So that said, so I grew up in the Bay Area, San Jose, and there was a local, back in the day, there was a local TV show called Creature Features hosted by a guy named Bob Wilkins. So anyone who's in the California area probably remembers that. So that's where I saw movies like, probably Night of the Living Dead is the first one I remember seeing. I remember seeing things like the reincarnation of Peter Proud, some of those kind of things, which then led into reading Stephen King. So I was reading Stephen King probably way too young than I should have. And which a lot of horror reading, and then probably I spent a lot of time in the 80s reading Clive Barker. I think it was late 80s, early 90s when Clive came out. So when the Books of Blood came on the scene, that was a pretty big deal for me. So those were probably the biggest influences. Obviously, a lot of films. So like there's a lot of the horror films that influenced me are things like The Exorcist and The Omen and All the Devil Made Me Do It's a Rosemary Baby is the World. So you'll probably see a theme of that in a lot of the stuff I write is some of those things.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. Well, next, last, definitely not least, is Thorin. I just wanted to give a shout out to Thorin too, because he's the one who did all our graphics and our Twitch OBS and like everything that you're seeing. So thank you to Thorin for that. Thorin, son of Thrain Thompson, is a part-time scribbler behind Owl Knight Publishing. His third-party adventure funnel, Sky of Crimson Flame, can currently be purchased on the Goodman Games website.
That's right.
So Thorin.
What?
Yep. I didn't want to cut you off, but yeah, what got you into horror last but not least?
I guess it would have to be Universal horror movies that my grandfather would show me, and like Nosferatu and all these things he had on tape. And from that, I really grew a love of horror, and seeing the covers in my parents' comic book shop of like Ravenloft and stuff like that, I would all these 2E splat books I would stare at and flip through the pages, and just I loved it. I loved Halloween. I loved horror, and it wasn't until I stumbled across the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game that I actually started reading a whole lot of stuff, and it was picking up that first book that got me into Lovecraft and reading the story inside of it. And since then, my collection has grown tenfold. So that's pretty much it.
That's awesome. I think we have such a varied group of experiences here. I mean, I heard Lovecraft mentioned a lot. I heard, the cinematic history of horror mentioned, but I just feel like I wanted to ask you all. So I would encourage our audience, if you have any questions for our panel, go ahead and type them in that Q&A section or in the Twitch chat. But while we're waiting for those to come in, I just wanted to ask all of you, what different types of horror are there? And if there's horror that, I don't know, appeals to you the most, or just the whole point of horror is to make you feel how, like, just if anybody wants to take that, I would say, Bob, you have a lot of genre spanning experience. So do you have a specific?
Well, I'm partial. I tend to be partial to Lovecraft's concept of cosmic horror, of man's insignificance being a large portion of building dread. But you don't ever really want to just stand on one type of horror. There's so many. I mean, body horror has recently been a very big thing. People losing control of their bodies or changing. Videodrome is a classic film example of that.
Cronenberg's probably the pro of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so whatever you like, there's something there, and you can always draw on it. You can draw on a love for universal horror, kind of the classic movie monsters, and adapt that and bring other facets of the horror genres into it. But yeah, I would say my favorite is still definitely going to be cosmic horror, but there's a lot out there.
That's awesome. I think I'm going to flip this question. I know that, Stephen, I'm going to throw this to you a little bit. We talked a little bit about just in today's day and age, are there certain types of horror that have maybe fallen out of favor, or maybe aren't as consensual as they used to be, or how, when you're creating a horror atmosphere, how do you keep consent or maybe using the X card in mind as you create horror? Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to discuss there. I think what I would say about it, because this is a gaming podcast, the challenge of horror in gaming is when you're watching a horror movie, when you're reading a horror book, the editor, the director, the writer is controlling the flow, the atmosphere, the editing. And so as a judge or as a writer, the trick becomes, how do I create horror in a game sort of way versus like actually controlling the entire, the players have to have agency and whatnot. And so I think as it relates to your consent and X cards and whatnot, what you want to do is you want to create horrific environments, and you want to create a horror element, because I think on its face, gaming is heroic. So you create a foe, and then you create people attacking a foe. And I think to the heart of your point is, to me, what there's a lot of things. There's gore, and there's obviously you can put descriptions into certain encounters or monsters. But what makes a horror adventure is when you have to make questionable moral choices, or you put a character into questionable moral things, and that's where consent becomes really important. And I think you have to be very careful as a judge to monitor that. So you want to give characters enough that they feel uncomfortable with some of the choices they have to make, while at the same time trying not to cross that boundary.
And just for anybody who doesn't know, X cards are a commonly used thing at the gaming table, where if for any reason, no explanation, you just don't feel comfortable in a situation, which is really important, in an existential dread sort of situation of horror, you can just throw down a card that has an X on it, situation gets passed over, no questions asked, and it's just a way to create a safe space at your gaming table. So thank you, Stephen, for going into that a little bit. On a lighter note, I wanted to ask Thorin, how do you make horror fun? Like, if you're actually at a gaming table, like, I love comedic horror, like, just I like to laugh. I like Army of Darkness. I like all those kind of like silly horror movies where I can just laugh and then also be grossed out or terrified. So how do you incorporate a sense of adventure and fun while still terrifying the players?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say definitely drawing on the big creep factor that you can get from, severed body parts moving around and, like idle hands, creeping up on, crawling up on your body and trying to choke you and stuff like that. It's creepy, but at the same time, it can be funny. I suppose it depends on what someone's humor is, what they think funny is, but yeah, just I mean, for me, it's like crazy, just going beyond to a certain crazy level where it's just ridiculous. Just gallons and gallons of blood, or just too much gore that it becomes less horrific and more funny. But still, if you really think about it, it's like, wow, that was pretty messed up. What just happened to all of us.
Wasn't there flying baby heads in your adventure?
There were flying baby heads in my adventure, yeah.
Okay,
And see,
just checking.
that's pretty funny. Depending on who you ask.
How you describe the heads, yeah.
Yeah. It's also, playing that game, which I've done a lot. You want to make the nice little cooing sound as the babies flap in, a little like it's all about sound effects and the right prose to get the right atmosphere going.
Absolutely. And I know we have some performers in this group, and that's what really makes a great judge is when you can just, ask Carmen Vance about my sound effects in her game, but really it's just a group effort because then your players get into it and they can also laugh, and then like all of a sudden their heart just drops out of the bottom of their torso like in the next scene. So that's great. I saw that Brad raised his hand, and then Bob, you still have your hand raised. Did you have something after Brad? Okay, Brad, go ahead with what you wanted to add.
I was going to, Thorin kind of touch on that. Yeah, I think where comedic horror comes into play is, going some completely over the top, like somebody getting an arm cut off with a chainsaw is horrific. Somebody getting cut in half with a chainsaw becomes silly. Or, somebody getting decapitated is, but if it goes boink to boink to boink to boink, boink to boink to boink across the room, then it becomes funny. Would you agree with that, guys?
Yeah,
That
most
is
definitely.
Totally my sense of humor.
Yeah. Well,
Perfect.
Bob can tell you, I actually wrote a comedic horror. I've written multiple comedic horror games. So, this is something I've had to work with a lot over the years.
That's awesome. And then Bob, what were you going to add?
Well, first of all, shout out for Nightlife, the game that was better than anything World of Darkness put out, but was handicapped by a marketing campaign that wasn't as wealthy. I love that game still. But I think with horror, because there's already a suspension of disbelief, you can bring in the absurd. I have a tendency to run a series of adventures based on a reality show that is on Destination America called Mountain Monsters. So it's essentially 5 good old boys running around the woods with shotguns, and the stories sort of write themselves. And so you can have these kind of comedic characters that suddenly get into something really grim, that are suddenly in over their head. And that juxtaposition really makes the horror more impactful when it finally happens. You could laugh, have a good time, and then just have that moment where your spine is just ice.
Or
Yes.
missing.
I think that's great. And I see that while we were talking, we do have some questions that came in. First one, this is probably for Brendan LaSalle. He's not on the panel today, but from Shade of Icarus on Twitch, is Chud the greatest movie of all time?
Cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers, or
I still maintain Chud 2, Bud the Chud is better.
okay.
But they're certainly up there. Yeah, Brendan watches it every year. I don't watch it every year, but I'll rewatch it. It's a good movie. It actually does hold up in a bug-eyed rubber sort of way.
I actually think I saw that at an actual drive-in.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chud Night is the tradition that needs to be upheld always. So from No Label TRPG on Twitch, they asked, what's the most important for a horror RPG adventure? Monsters, atmosphere, or tropes? And I am actually going to throw this to Steven first, but if anybody else wants to say what their most important is, go ahead and chime in after.
I would say, so I've now written a few of these, and I've used each one. So like Corpse was heavy on atmosphere. I think Creep Scrab Creep was heavy on trope. I mean, it like liberally just adapted Alien and The Thing. I just tried to gamify it. So I think I would just say, as a designer or a writer or a judge, just think of, if you've got a favorite movie, right? Maybe your favorite movie is Twilight for whatever reason. Just think about what you like about Twilight and how do I gamify that? I would always say, like, as any kind of creator, and I put judges in this category, is like, these projects, even if it's just to prepare for a game, takes so much energy, that do something you love, and because you're going to be spending a lot of time with that project. So start with something you love and just go from there.
Very good. Does anybody else have anything to add?
I would say it depends. If you're trying to go more comedic horror, I would go tropes or the monsters. If you're trying to do a serious horror adventure, atmosphere 100%.
Yeah, I think setting up the environment for the players, like getting, if people like the read aloud text or like to paraphrase it, but setting that up in just the right manner, so everyone gets those creepy vibes. That's essential. And I think artwork really does help if there's handouts, obviously, to show, especially for these multi-dimensional beings from beyond that are hard to describe.
Even though God knows Lovecraft, right? You'd like to spend 3 and 4 pages describing things that were indescribable.
Yes.
Technically, anything can be named. Nothing is technically unnameable. Yeah.
Well, that gets me right into my next question, which is actually for Brad.
Okay.
Something so visceral and visual and descriptive in text. How do you work with writers to produce the artwork and horror specifically, because the things are so out of this world? I mean, what's your process usually like? How much of it is your vision? How much of it is theirs?
Well, when I'm doing something for like Call of Cthulhu or Age of Cthulhu, it's like, okay, it's Lovecraft, so that kind of sets the parameters. I follow as far as I can with what they're kind of describing, and then it's like, okay, then I kind of start dolloping on with lighting, as much atmosphere as possible, and just working from the text. Do they want this gothic, or do they want it gory, or whatnot? So it's kind of like you rely on what they're saying to a certain point, and then you got to go the extra mile.
I love that you brought in lighting to that, because just being able to change that feel or that atmosphere based on what's required, just I feel like it brings so many more dimensions to the art. So I know Thorin on Twitch might be showing some of your art at some point, so I'm excited about that. Thorin,
I want to add one quick note to that. When I did the cover for Obadiah Feltner, I went with Felix Byron, who has done the last several of my covers. But one of my early influences, what I didn't mention, was the show Night Gallery from Rod Serling. And so what I did for them is I asked Felix and I said, look at all of the covers that they would open that show with, and I want that kind of vibe. And then I let Felix do what they do, which was pretty awesome. So I was pretty pleased with how that turned out.
That's awesome. We do have another question from Twitch. This is from dbeecher86. I always thought the implied horror in The Haunting plays well on the viewer's imagination. What's a good way to do that at the table? And since you kind of have to prey on the player's, imagination, I'm going to throw this one to Bob first.
In situations like that, it's something you need to start subtle and build. I ran a horror themed D&D adventure years ago where they'd found kind of a rotting manse in a swamp, and the first thing they noticed inside was the interior dimensions didn't match to the outside. So there was this subtle creep factor, and there was scratching in the walls, and slowly built it up to essentially finding a secret room that was a chimney that went up 3 floors in a 2-story building that was lined with flayed human skins that were moving. And one of my players still complains about that. But it's all about building. You're not going for shock factor and things like that. You want small details and build, and then you might not want to take things that far. You might just want to keep a creepy vibe in whatever adventure you're running. Just throw in those details. Tell people that, they see something out of the corner of their eye and they turn and there's nothing there. Those things that make the players question the reality of their characters can make a big difference.
Yeah, just subtly changing details that make no sense. Like, wait a moment. We only, this dinner table was only set for 3 people, and why are there 4 plates here now? It's like, what's going on? Kind of stuff like that.
Yeah, tapping into the imagination by picking up clues and having that discovery, and so they can live it instead of just telling. Yeah, I really like that.
For a creep, what I did is before, like, each round before the monster would attack, I would give the judge hints like, you're going to hear birds squalling, or you're going to hear a scratching, or I had this whole list of, like, it was a table of, like, atmospheric events that would precede an attack that would always happen for each round.
Oh, if only I was given so much warning before I get into danger. That's awesome. Our next question is from Michael Little 1008 on Twitch. What are the panelists' views on creating quiet horror? Namely, when characters experience a dreadful epiphany or make a dreadful discovery that puts the fate or their souls in question. And Thorin, I'm actually going to ask you first.
The first thing I think about with that is in They Served Brandolin Red, when you figure out that the wine, what's it called? Help me out here.
If only we knew somebody who knew something about that adventure.
Yes.
The wine press?
The wine press, that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. So when you figure that out, like, the player, like, is forced to scream that out, like, oh my God, and they go a little crazy. That doesn't quite go with the quiet epiphany style, but that's the first thing that I thought of. I think someone else should take this away before I start rambling.
I personally like it when people can pull off a good bit of quiet horror, because I think that's the kind of stuff that actually sticks with you a lot longer. You were talking about the Haunting just a few minutes ago. I assume you've all seen that movie at some point, right? Okay, remember the scene where the 2 girls are holding hands in the middle of the night because they're so scared and they think there's a monster right out in the hallway? And then the one wakes up and realizes that, whose hand was I holding all night? That's a classic bit of quiet horror that didn't require much of it, didn't really do much of anything. But I remember that, and I haven't read that book again since in like 30 years. That I think is one of the ultimate bits in literature of quiet horror. You know, and if you can pull stuff off like that, that's the kind of stuff the players are going to remember years after that session, after they've killed dragons, yada, yada, yada. They're going to remember, oh, that was creepy.
Bob, go ahead.
Rob's on
you're
mute.
You're muted. Sorry.
There we are. With a lot of horror, things tend to be very visceral, and with quiet horror, like Brad mentioned, a lot of classic urban legends are really that quiet horror, that moment of realization after the fact. Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights? That wasn't the dog licking your hands. And so when players have those realizations after the fact, or they put together something that has happened in the past. Not all horror needs to have that sense of immediacy. When they find out, oh my God, these people were sacrificing children, and they put that together, that what they've been walking on and crunching are small bones. There was never any danger. There was never any threat, but there's that realization that something bad has happened. And those moments, like Brad said, people cling to those and remember them.
The body in the mattress.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm just going to give two more examples. I think two of the best horror adventures for Dungeon Crawl Classics are not actually in the horror line, and that's Harley's brilliant Bride of the Black Manse, as you slowly discover what's going on in the manse and the characters. I think that's a great, like, Mike Flanagan, like Hill House, Bly Manor, if you're into that sort of thing, the discovery of what's going on there. And also, even though it's an MCC adventure, Michael Curtis's Evil of the Ancients, as you continue to go through this complex, and like it's got a very Cthulhian, to me, Evil of the Ancients is a cross between The Shining, where the place itself is almost like the hotel, the Overlook, and then the Cthulhian horror, which has infected everyone, which you slowly discover. So I think those are really good examples of like how you can make a creepy adventure without having the bucket of blood or like the over the top. Although Mr. Curtis does throw in an over the top monster at the end if you really need one. So.
Leading on from that, I wanted to ask you all, how do you build the suspense and the feeling of horror without picking off the party members one by one, Last Girl style, where, if your goal isn't a complete TPK, how do you put little, traps along the way so that they know there's danger? And Bob touched on that, where like there's no actual danger, but sometimes maybe there is. Like, how do you balance it not being too deadly? I'm going to say, since Bob touched on that, I'm going to start with you, Bob, but how to extend that feeling.
Well, my favorite style of horror adventure is certainly investigative. And so as people start finding things and piecing things together, it's a perfect way to build dread for what's coming. They talk to someone and he gives an oral history of the local town, and then you start digging in. The successful horror doesn't have to be in your face all the time. It can just build, in the background until you have that huge release towards the end where there's finally a massive confrontation. You want to have maybe one or two small things along the way, but you don't, it doesn't have to be like a standard dungeon adventure where it's kick in the door, fight the thing, and move forward. Instead, it's those pieces that they put together and the creativity that your players bring into it that builds upon the clues you're giving, because the imagination of your players is their worst enemy.
Ain't that the truth? We do have another question from Twitch. This is from CodeCat. Brad, I'm actually going to throw this question to you first. Okay. Any fantasy horror novelists specifically who've inspired you?
Lovecraft, obviously. And I found Clive Barker is very, he's such a visceral, you know, he's such a visceral writer because he is primarily an artist. It actually works against him a lot of the times as an actual writer, but it's great for drawing visual inspiration from. I would say, yeah, Lovecraft and Barker, some Skip and Spectre, if anybody's familiar with those authors anymore.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I read all their stuff. The splatterpunk movement. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
The light, their novel, The Light at the End, almost sabotaged my writing career. Actually, Bob knows exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, I started writing Nightlife and then came across The Light at the End, which is possibly the most brutal vampire novel I've ever read. But yeah, definitely Lovecraft and Barker would be the numbers 1 and 2 there.
Nice. Anybody else?
I'd maybe throw in early Peter Straub, not his later work where, like King, he decided to go from horror to psychological, but the early things, Ghost Story and Shadowland is a particular favorite of mine. I reread that one every year.
I would throw in Basil Copper. He's got some good stuff like The Great White Space, which is a little Lovecraftian, sort of a little bit like Beyond the Mountains of Madness. And then even Robert E. Howard, he's got some great stories like Wolf's Head and what's that one? The
one
Black
is,
Monolith or something like that.
People of the Monolith.
Yeah.
I was thinking a lot of his Solomon Kane stuff is at least borderline horror, especially like the right hand of doom.
Yes, yeah, those are great too.
There was some dude, something about Poe, Edgar Allan Poe.
Never heard of that guy.
Yeah, I don't know. I heard he did some things as well. So,
it goes back to that wine theme. How far and deep will you go into a cellar to get something good? But yeah, I'm a huge Poe fan. I got another question. This is actually from No Label RPG on Twitch. What do the panelists think about a horror mechanic such as the typical insanity madness mechanic in Call of Cthulhu? Should DCC horror introduce a losing self-control mechanic, sort of akin to DCC Langmar as a fleeting luck mechanic? So since we've, summoned Fleeting Luck and Langmar, I will throw this to Bob first, but anybody else can, chime in with their thoughts after Bob.
Sanity mechanics are always kind of hit or miss. Call of Cthulhu relies on it very heavily, but it's something you need to apply with care once you're putting it into action, because otherwise things become cartoonish and can detract from the horror rather than build on it. I mean, the example they used to give in the core book was someone has a moment of mad inspiration while being attacked by a vampire, so they yell, "Quick, everybody into the kitchen," because that's where garlic is. But things like that, they don't really enhance what you're doing. Losing control mechanics, I don't really know as DCC horror needs it. I think that knowing the DCC community as we do, first of all, and the players that we encounter all the time, and the people whose tables we play at, I don't know is it something that anybody needs to be able to push that role playing button a little further. I mean, if you've got a player that's sort of in their shell, then something like that is a great tool to help push them forward. But most of the people that I encounter don't really need it.
Did anybody else have any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I would say
ahead.
if you needed a good hard mechanic, you could just have a will save, and they can either lose luck or they could lose some intelligence, depending on what, if it's the madness driven or whatnot, and maybe that can come back. It's temporary, so it could be, depending on what you see, it's a 1d3 die, or you go up the die chain, and that's the more, if you were looking at Great Cthulhu as opposed to just a night gaunt, then you're going to roll a d20 and maybe you'll go permanently mad, and get down to the negative numbers, or maybe you'll just go temporarily mad. But if that could be a hard fast mechanic to be used.
Bob, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I got to think. There is a game out there that has a mechanic that's meant not to represent fear for the characters, but to build tension for the players. There's a game out there called Dread. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with it. It uses a Jenga tower. There are no dice, and you make pulls, and if the tower falls, you're dead. And I have never left a game of Dread in a state less than completely jacked out of my mind on adrenaline, because that tension is there. And so maybe look to ways to crank it for your players more than the characters.
You could do that similarly with the dice chain in DCC. Like maybe there's a dread die in it. When you finally hit one or two, like a fumble on that die, then something bad happens, but it continually decreases as time goes on through the adventure.
And Mothership has a mechanic, but it's been a little bit. I've only played once or twice, but I remember the Mothership mechanic was pretty good as well.
I know how they can do it. You have to stack 20-sided dice on top of each other.
That'll do it.
Oh, crud.
I love these towers of doom. It's like a physical representation of always feeling like everything's going to fall apart. But
I know. Make them do D4s.
Going on that kind of like adding a Jenga tower mechanic, or not really, like permanently damaging the intelligence stat or adding a fleeting luck mechanic. Do any of you use any sort of like, or have you ever used any sort of like props or costuming or anything like that at your tables to add to the atmosphere? I see Bob laughing, but Stephen, I'm going to ask, like, how do you usually set your table? Is it all theater of the mind, or have you used props in the past?
I have, the only like prop I would say I've used is I will have like a smart speaker or the iPad in the background, and I will use atmospheric music. So I will use a lot of sound effects. I'll use like, you can, anywhere on YouTube you can find 2 hours of cave noise or something like that. So dimmed lighting and sound effects is about the most I get into with props.
Anybody else? Especially, go ahead, Brad. And like, I'm interested too how you would incorporate that in a con setting. But go ahead, Brad.
Oh, I was going to say, the music reminds me, and Bob will appreciate this. There was one time I was running that game Nightlife, and the players had to go to a nightclub. And I had just quietly, before the game even started, brought out my little boombox. I'm kind of dating how long ago this was. And it's like, and as you open the door, and I just reached over quick, so that they had a full feeling of having just walked into a full-fledged New York nightclub on a Friday night. Other times, there was a humor game that I used to play called Late Show. We did a fantasy, and I had some pool noodles, and I was basically like, we were the players and I were whapping each other with pool noodles to simulate the sword fight. So yes, we do use props. I'm not much of a gamer anymore because, well, my wife doesn't like being hit with pool noodles.
I love that it's turned into like a full-on LARP, just like in the middle of your table game.
Exactly.
Did anybody else have any memorable props or experiences at the table?
I'm a handout fetishist. I've run campaigns where by the time it's done, they've collected a book of various handouts. Feelies of any sort are always great to have at the table. I ran a modern investigative game where at the end of each session they'd put in what they were requesting, and I had Interpol reports, missing person reports. But I also have friends in California who will periodically find and make strange little things, put them in a box, and ship them to me as just, hey, Bob, here's inspiration, go. And I've written adventures. I'm like, okay, I've got these props. The players are going to get them in their hands. Where are they from? Stuff like that is great. When you can describe something, it's good. When you can show someone a picture, it's better. When you can put it in their hand and let them feel it, there's nothing like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Cool.
I do cheat with that. I do put in a lot of like the captain's log or the research notes and stuff like that and putting those out in advance. So I totally agree with Bob on those things. Anything you can like
and for music,
slide over, yeah.
And for music, I tend to use The Serpent's Egg by Dead Can Dance on repeat. So.
Oh, there you go.
Dungeon synth is where I go with music. There's so much good dungeon synth these days. It's amazing. And you can get those LED flame bulbs. They're going down in price nowadays, and they're really cool. Got one on my front porch. And
Same here. Ed hates it.
and go to your local farm and pick up a black goat and just have it sitting beside you at the game table. You know, a little Black Phillip will do
Black
wonders.
Phillip, right.
To really evoke the right mood.
Especially if you're playing Toon.
Yes.
That is awesome. Well, we've got some more questions from Twitch. This is from Zactivix. Any inspiration or interesting storytelling techniques from PC or console games? Do any of you use that as inspiration? Thorin, I'll toss that to you if you've ever cross-genred your gaming.
I suppose I've probably taken inspiration. I take inspiration from every facet of life. I couldn't tell you any particular thing that I could pinpoint, though, that I was like, from this particular game I stole this idea, or something like that. But the answer is yes, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, I think it's video games have really exploded because I feel like there's time now to tell a story, and I feel like they took that from us. That you can extend a campaign, or you can have a 150-hour game that you want to keep exploring because you want to. It's that same drive of imagination to find out more. So, if anybody else has anything to add to that? If not, I will go to the next question from DeBeacher86 on Twitch. Should you try to take enchanted swords with you when escaping the mansion of a vampire?
So yeah, this is a person that was involved in my first TPK ever.
Nice.
We were playing Transylvanian Adventures. They released one separate adventure for it. I had a packed table. It came with pre-gens, and you could have them as men or women, and I used all of them. So we had a table of 12. And by the time the party had split the fourth time and 3 combats were ongoing, I knew things weren't going to go well. And we got down to the last 2 survivors. They've beaten the big demon, and they're getting ready to leave. And the vampire lord rises up and forms in front of them and even says, I'll let you take the magic sword with you, but one of you needs to stay to meet my needs. And one of the players like, I'll do it. And walked up. He's like, I throw holy water in his face. And so in the adventure, I opened up to the page where it says, so you decided to piss off the vampire lord, because it was in the adventure, which I absolutely loved. And he died, and then the person asking the question decided to try and make it out with the sword. And at 11:11 on Free RPG Day, I had my first TPK. So no, don't do it.
At Free RPG Day, was it DCC days or Free RPG Day that you were sequestered live at the game store?
This year, that was DCC Day this year.
Yes. Yeah. I think that those events throughout the course of this actual horror of a year have given us life, and the fact that your game store was so awesome to give you like that sealed room that could.
Dungeon Games has a beautiful environment through the entire store, and the fact that they have that little sequestered inn that you can run in is even better. But yeah, 2020 is sort of making me rethink my love of all things horror.
perspective, all of that. But I think
I'm ready
that
to play Fluffy Bunnies, run Fluffy Bunnies the RPG.
Maybe we should play like Teenagers from Outer Space. Maybe we should play some TFOS.
yes.
Well, the Glowburn guys shut down. They're like, man, we can't talk about like the apocalypse during the apocalypse. So it killed off one of our favorite podcasts.
Well, I've heard before that a lot of people gravitate towards horror for a form of escape, for a form of perspective of like, well, at least it's not that bad. Like, at least we're not surrounded by fish people cultists. Oh, wait, sorry. Or at least, we don't have like, our planet flying into the sun for another billion years. And so
it's a lot tougher this year. It really is a lot tougher to say, at least it's not that bad. My favorite disaster of 2020 was the radioactive forest fire in Russia, because who gets to say radioactive forest fire? I'm going to put that in adventure eventually. I mean, so many things have happened this year that you would never consider. I mean, the writer needs to be fired because my suspension of disbelief is gone.
I think the hairy venomous caterpillars in Virginia is pretty much like, especially the ones that are orange. I mean, that's like you
stay away.
It makes you long for the simpler days of flesh-eating bacteria, right?
That joke.
I think when I read about like the like things they're pulling out of the ground, like the cursed, like mummy from like
the big black coffin.
Yeah, it's like don't open that. Like, we don't need that right now. But yeah, I'm sure there might be some more adventures written and spawned and designed from the actual events of this year.
When 2020 is in the rearview mirror, it's going to make a lot of great adventure fodder. It's just a little too close and personal for a lot of us right now.
To your point there, Laura, my next horror adventure, I'm going to give a spoiler alert, even though it hasn't been announced. It steals all the mummy tropes, so it's effectively a mummy adventure. So if you're playing that with me tomorrow, ignore that I just said that. But the mummy juice makes an appearance that you just talked about. So
we heard that song earlier today.
Right.
I think it's interesting too how in the 20th century, 2020 was looked at as a beacon of the future, the either utopian or dystopian future or cyberpunk future of, there was still kind of this thread of hope or despair. And now I feel like looking at it in the rear view mirror, it's going to be interesting to see how it's referenced now that we have some context of living through it. But we do have another question from CodeCat on Twitch. Speaking of 2020, this year, do you feel like you have more or less time to write? And I'm going to ask Thorin first, and then anybody else.
I definitely have more time, but just the static nature of your day-to-day life, you need to get out and get your brain working so that when you come back, your mind's refreshed. But the monotonous, here I am, here's cat food for the cats, here's I'm scooping litter boxes now, I'm doing this. So it's hard to get yourself out of that mindset and into the creative space that you can really dive into. And I find myself constantly right now just I'm typing, and then I'll flutter off somewhere and then come back and be like, well, what happened? That was 2 hours ago, So that's where I'm at anyways.
Bob?
I think that, as a Floridian, when this whole thing started, it's sort of like hunkering down for a hurricane. You put up your shutters and you wait it out. And so disaster fatigue sets in, and I think I have more time, but not as much energy, not as much mindset. The Malevolent 7, the adventure I've got coming out for Dark Trails, I was nearly finished with it when I scrapped the entire thing and started over, because I looked at it and the place I was writing it from was just so mentally exhausted and filled with real existential dread that it wasn't good for anybody. There's more time, but I'm finding it a bit more challenging.
I have the same question for Brad, but more centered around art. How do you feel that 2020 has affected your creative process and making art?
Well, that's kind of hard to answer. This is almost my first real year functioning almost pretty much strictly as a freelance artist. Before this, I've always kind of balanced artwork and having a real world job, even though it was not the world's greatest job. But so now that I'm having to make all my money off artwork, it's pushing me to be more productive that way. But at the same time, the level of stress makes it that much harder to be able to say, and just kind of like, okay, buckle down, So entirely too often I'm kind of like, I'm doing the artwork simply to get the bills paid rather than I'm adding something to the artistic language of the world, if as arrogant as that may sound. So I'm really hoping to get back to a point where the world is boring so that I don't have to worry about what's going on out there. And all I have to worry about is how to compose this picture, how to ink this picture, how to make this particular illustration as effective as possible. Hopefully 2021.
Yeah, I'm definitely ready for that. I feel like we need art and writing and places to escape, and like almost like by diving into people's writing and art, we can have a change of scenery that we so desperately need. And by going through adventures with teamwork or friends across the country or the world that we can't see in person, like it gives the brain the stimulation it needs to go on an adventure, to figure something out, to solve a mystery. And I definitely feel like we need that right now. So gaming is literally surviving right now. So thanks again to Goodman Games for putting on their third con of this year that I could attend and, see my friends and just, come together and do something that we all love. So it's because of you all that, Bob, I actually got to play test with Keith Nilsson, the Malevolent 7.
Oh, good
So
deal.
I cannot wait until that gets published. I'm so excited.
I'm glad to hear it. I look forward to fine-tuning it after all the playtests are done.
Oh yeah, I'll probably play it again, and then Steven dropping like little spoilers like this might be coming out soon, and I always get excited about that too. So yeah, I
would not have liked the original manuscript. It just wasn't good.
First drafts are first drafts,
Oh no, it went in a wholly different direction when I scrapped it. It didn't come from a good place. And once I was able to get into that headspace, I was able to give Dave something that I wasn't embarrassed of.
Yeah, I'm excited to get all of that in the mail. So I'm very excited. But we do have another question from CodeCat on Twitch. What are the ways that you decompress after living and breathing horror adventures? So after you've lived in the world of your adventure, how do you breathe and decompress? I'm actually going to throw that to Steven, how you separate, like go back to your home life after being in the horror world. So Steven, I'll throw to you first.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I think at the end of the day, any adventure, horror, otherwise Western, post-apoc, it's all about friendship and fellowship and bonding. So I always try to save 15 minutes after a game. Like I'll end a game with like a few minutes early, like what did you like, what did you not like, and really just talk about their experiences with it, because really I do this because I want people to have that escape. I want them to enjoy it, and I want to see what's working, what's not working. So that's, to me, sort of the final, the nut course or whatever it is after an adventure, is to like just really get how the other players, the people who interpreted the work or who actually brought it to life, really experienced it. And it also brings you back to reality. It takes you out of the mood and then, brings you back to real life.
So I wanted to ask, out of all of our panelists, does everybody here generally run games at cons? Like, Brad, are you a judge at conventions as well?
Actually, I don't do much gaming. I actually only started gaming again a bit with Brendan LaSalle. Just, real life and, the pressures of trying to, keep head above water. I just didn't really have the time to game, and a lot of where I used to live, it was basically D&D or nothing, and I'm like, I literally have not played D&D itself since about 1987 or so. So
in the before time.
In the long ago.
So you said that. Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, just an amusing story. Once I got active in the gaming industry, I of course tried to break TSR, obviously. So tried for years and years and years. Finally, kind of just gave up. It's like, obviously they're never going to use me. So Larry Smith, the editor of Dragon magazine, finally contacted me at actually my day job at the time. And he's like, oh, do you want to? Of course I want to do some work for you, Larry. And he starts describing this, the adventure to me with all the different monsters I'm going to have to draw. And I'm like, Larry, I'm not sure how to say this, but I have no idea what any of these creatures are, and I got rid of all my D&D books years ago. And he just laughed and said, okay, don't worry about it. What's your fax number? And about 10 minutes later, I'm back at my art desk, and the boss kind of stomps over with this stack of faxes. I think these are for you. Because it was all different stuff from the, stuff from the monster manual of the monsters I was going to have to draw and such. Like, I think these are for you. It's like,
you
anyhow,
got that fax at work?
Yeah, that was at work. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Bob, were you going to say something? Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, but yeah, I was like, oh, great. I just finally made my breakthrough to TSR, and I'm gonna have to shoot myself in the foot because I have no clue what a method is.
Yeah.
Anyhow, okay, go ahead, Bob.
I don't get to run games at Gen Con anymore. I don't get to run or really play at Gen Con unless maybe something at DugCon after hours, because with Marooned, we're performing. We have other responsibilities. I've been the assistant entertainment coordinator. But when it comes to like GaryCon, Free RPG Day, DCC Day, I love having those opportunities to run. And so anything other than Gen Con that I can get to, I run at.
How about you, Thorin? Are you running on the circuit?
Not this time because I've got to handle all this this Twitch stuff all weekend. So you're welcome, everyone.
Big thank you.
But usually I do. The last Cyclops Con I was playtesting my next adventure, which is nowhere near complete, but getting there slowly but surely. So
nice. Can't wait to hear about it when you're ready to talk about it. Steven, are you running these days? Just I know a ton of people are running your adventures. So are you doing any running personally?
So I'm like, yeah. So my man crush Julian Burnick and I, for the last two adventures, he and I have been swapping playtests or swapping. We do our adventure swap. So I'm playtesting his, he's playtesting mine. So I'll be doing that this weekend as well. So one of mine, one of his.
both of my games tomorrow are with Julian Burnick. So it is a Julian Burnick kind of day. I'm excited. So we do have a question from Zactivix on Twitch. What villains has 2020 inspired?
Oh boy.
I'm gonna, yeah. Based on that reaction, Stephen, I'm gonna go with you first.
Oh gosh.
It might be too soon. Too soon.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that. That is so. I'm going to try to keep this politically correct. So here's what I would say. I'm gonna dodge this question entirely. So what I would say is one of the genres that I think was really popular in the 80s and 90s is like the government conspiracy genre. So like the X-Files and some of that there are cigarette smoking men and the Illuminati and whatnot. And I think there is appetite to re-explore that in today's society. And I don't know the best way to gamify that in DCC, which is typically very episodic, but I would love to see more of that. So I think all the talk about the deep state and factions and these rise of whatever, pick your favorite villain faction.
Take it back to the table and away from QAnon. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I wasn't going to name names, but yeah, I would love to figure out a way to episodically gamify that. So because otherwise it's just like, oh, there's this band of bad guys called the Black Hand or whatever you want to call them. And then it just doesn't have the same staying power as something that like builds over time. The way I think we've seen 2020 build for us for the last several years.
Yeah, that kind of stuff basically needs more of an actual campaign setting more along the lines of something like what the old Secret of White Rock, where it's several adventures.
Yeah,
you can slide stuff into the background with.
Or like Delta Green for Call of Cthulhu, which is all about an illegal conspiracy within a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's the great untapped. I want someone to write that DCC adventure, and then I'll play that or judge that at the next con.
You got it.
So the last question that I'm going to ask you all, and this is probably kind of related, and we can also hit the skip button on this if we want, but Icarus asks, have you guys ever written or drawn anything that went too far, either for yourself or the editor? Like, have you ever had that experience where they're like, we need to take that back?
So I'm going to open with this one. So this is a true story. So with an adventure, and I won't say which one. I wrote to Joseph Goodman and I said, I think it's on the border between R and NC-17, but I want your opinion on it. And he wrote me back this email, which I've saved, which basically says, yeah, I'm not really sure where that borderline is, but I'm pretty sure that genital mutilation crosses that line. So I had to, and then I thought about doing a special edition that didn't have the DCC logo on it, but at the end of the day, it hit the cutting room floor. So yeah, when it comes to the body horror, yeah, I actually did cross the line. Didn't make it past the censors.
I had the same thing happen with Sky of Crimson Flame. I had two separate artists draw pictures, and they both featured some male genitalia just in the wind, and so I sent that to get approved, and of course it did not get approved. So I had to go into Photoshop and do a little erasing of those things. I still have the original pieces though. Can't let those go. But yeah, so I was going a little bit too far into one side over there. So
I've never had the issue where I oddly enough, I've never written anything with genital mutilation or genitals in the wind. But I have experienced a game that at least for a friend of mine was a bridge too far, even though I thought it was great fun. We were at Gen Con SoCal, and for the adventure, it was a Call of Cthulhu game. We all went into the conference room. We were given mine helmets, and all of the lights were turned off. So the only lights were from the mine helmets. And there were supposed to be 6 miners. There were 5 people in the room. and we were playing miners trapped in a cave-in, and we were told to turn out our lights because something happens and the lights go out. And then we started hearing the voice of a sixth player. And so we're moving towards this person, trying to find them, trying to rescue them. And that's when we're told we can turn our lights back on. And my friend Lynn is holding a MyGo brain case with an actual pig's brain in it, and she won't play Call of Cthulhu anymore. So there's that. Everybody has their line. I thought, but everyone has their personal line.
X card.
It's late at that point. You're holding the brain. It is too late. You can't X card in the dark.
Yeah, that's when you have the strobe lights that just make the X. So Thorin, I wanted to ask, did we get a chance, speaking of not going too far and things that have actually been published, did we get a chance to see, because I can't see our Twitch feed, Brad's art? Were we able to show that to our audience?
Let's do that right now. So let's fade in on this little slideshow. And Brad, maybe you can just tell us a bit about your technique or whatever.
And all you people on the webinar, just look at us. Hi.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess Brad, tell us a little bit about your technique, or something interesting with all these pictures you sent me.
Okay.
Or
I
not.
don't know if Brad can actually see them. Does he have Twitch going?
Yeah, can you see the Twitch feed right now? Because we can't
No, I
see.
can't actually.
No,
You
right.
remember what you sent him?
I'll describe them to you, and
Okay, yeah. If you can kind of describe each one, I can probably give you a little bit of.
A couple of these are from Brandolin, so there's like the centipede from Brandolin.
Yeah, I see some of the gods of Lankamar here popping up.
Okay, yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, I start with the basic work order and the size. I generally draw usually about 1.5, sometimes, and lately just more like 1 1/4 up from production size. So I just kind of I draw, kind of the box of the appropriate size, and then I just spend a couple minutes, kind of brainstorming what's going to be the most effective way to show this picture. And then I start, a very loose sketch, and depending on how inspired I'm feeling, sometimes it ends up being a very, very tight sketch. Also depends on, mental energy, how much caffeine I've had, how inspired the basic work order is, but mostly how much caffeine I've had. Or usually scan that at maybe 150 DPI, send that sketch off to the client, and if it's approved, then I just break out the pens or the brushes and go to town.
And these are all physical pieces, like it's not digital. This is all pen and ink.
Yeah,
and whatnot.
I'm very old school that way.
Cool.
And shout out to Jess McDevitt in chat. This is what I see on a daily basis. I don't have nightmares anymore.
Yeah.
So when you're married to an artist, you get all the front row seats to the art that's created and the mind that it comes from. I am also married to an artist, so I appreciate the dedication to the work.
Yeah,
so thank you so much.
Thing is, this is so much my bread and butter. I don't even register drawing most of this stuff as scary or anything. It's like, oh, draw this person with their intestines hanging out and draped around their neck. Okay, how many loops of intestines would you like? Should it be 2 or 3? Should maybe they be holding up one, like this? I don't know. That's
Speaking of Brad, physical art and the wine press, because we talked about it earlier.
Boom.
Oh, yeah.
I bought this from Mr. Brad a couple of years ago after Brand
Yeah.
came out. So there you go.
Very nice, very nice.
Bob, you were going to add something?
No, I just love Brad's art. I own a number of pieces myself. As a matter of fact, I own one of the pieces from Blasphemy and Larceny in Lankmar, because Brad captured the moment so perfectly. It went straight from my head onto the page. And that was Brad, because I certainly didn't express it that brilliantly. So
if it's any comfort, I actually had a local client where I literally would go into his store, and he was describing what he wanted this picture to be, and I'm sitting there sketching it as he is telling me, and he's like, it's just like the words are coming out of my mouth through down your arm and onto the page. Like, how are you doing this? Oh, that's my job.
It's the mind of an artist. Just like feed it well. And also support your local writers and artists. Shout out to all the friendly local gaming stores that, put local publications that people have written, or the third-party DCC products or the mainline DCC products. But just, if you want to support your writers and artists, like, buy their stuff, like it actually does put food on the table, when you feed your local artists and writers. So I always say, support your artist and creative friends. It's always appreciated. So to wrap things up on that note, I wanted to just thank our panelists. If we have any more questions in chat that we didn't get a chance to get to, feel free to post them on social media, or just reach out to your favorite panelists and ask them directly. I wanted to thank everybody today for being here and being a part of injecting horror into your adventures. And thank you for answering all those questions and sharing your stories.
this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with you guys today.
Thanks again, Laura. Thank you, Susan. Thanks, Thorin, for setting all this up. And thanks everybody out there in Twitch land or webinar land.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to keep in touch, Thorin says that if one wishes to follow the antics of this 2-bit wizard, check out Son of Thorin, that's SONOVTHRAIN, on Twitter or Instagram. Stephen can be found at www.thickskulladventures.com, on Twitter at thickskulladv, or on Facebook by searching Thick Skull Adventures. Brad may be most easily reached at bkmcdevitt, DEVITT, at yahoo.com, and on Facebook under Bradley K. McDevitt, which he updates almost daily with new artwork and occasionally humorous commentary. Bob is on the web at sanctum.media, and on Twitter at, and pronounce it for me, Bob, so I don't pronounce
Seronymous.
it. Seronymous, which is spelled CERONOMUS. Now, for a special treat to end the seminar, we have a reading from Bob. So Bob, go ahead whenever you're ready.
To set the scene, this is building to the climax of an adventure where the characters have been trapped underground. It has been a Call of Cthulhu cavern crawl, and this is their final moments before everything goes very bad. As you stare at the nightmarish corpse before you, the sound of shuffling feet draws ever closer. The lurkers in the darkness, last of the Zanaeans, arrive. Towering at 8 feet tall, the sickly white skin of the creatures nearly glows in the ever-present green phosphorance of the fungi that lines the walls. Writhing along their naked bodies, tendril-like worms feast on their flesh and bloat their bellies. Sensing you more than sighting you, they rush forward, their stomachs tearing open as they charge, spilling more of the sickly worms onto the floor around you. The masters of Devil's Hole have arrived.
Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone. Have a great Bride of Cyclops Con. Goodbye.
See ya.